In the summer of 1988, the worst drought in 50 years came to Calhoun County, Iowa, and stayed. It did not arrive dramatically. It crept in the way droughts always creep, slowly, almost politely, one dry week following another, the topsoil cracking a little more each morning, the creek levels dropping an inch at a time, the sky staying blue and clear and merciless day after day, while the corn rolled its leaves and the beans turned yellow at the edges, and the farmers watched their yield projections revise themselves downward every time they walked their fields. By July, the county had received 4 inches of rain since April. The 10-year average for that period was 14. The forecast showed no relief in sight. The wells were dropping. The creek that crossed the center of the county, Miller's Fork, was running at 20% of its normal flow, a thin brown trickle where there should have been a respectable stream. And the modern irrigation systems that most of the county's larger operations had installed during the expansion years of the 1970s were running around the clock, pumping groundwater from wells that were getting deeper and more expensive to operate with every passing week. The county extension office was fielding 30 calls a day. The Farm Service Agency had set up an emergency assistance desk. The local John Deere dealership, Kruger Farm Equipment, run by a man named Bill Kruger who had sold more irrigation pumps than anyone in 3 counties during the 1970s boom, was backed up 6 weeks on service calls for systems running past their design limits. Bill Kruger drove past every farm in his service area twice a week that summer, checking on the systems he had sold, watching the gauges, listening to the pumps. He was proud of his equipment. He had reason to be. His irrigation systems were among the most modern in the region, variable rate pumps with pressure sensors and automated controls that adjusted output based on soil moisture readings. State of the art in 1978 when he had sold most of them. Still impressive in 1988. He was less proud by mid-July. The groundwater table in Calhoun County had dropped further and faster than anyone had projected. Wells that were rated for sustained pumping at their designed output were pulling air. Pressure sensors were triggering shutdowns. Automated controls were doing exactly what they were designed to do, protecting the pumps from running dry, which meant that on the hottest days when the crops needed water most, the systems were shutting themselves off. Bill drove past the Hargrove farm on a Tuesday afternoon and saw something that made him slow down. A field of corn that was not rolling its leaves. The Hargrove farm was 240 acres on the west side of the county, bordered on the north by Miller's Fork and on the south by a long, gentle slope that ran down from the county road toward the creek bottom. It had been in the Hargrove family since 1891, when Elias Hargrove had homesteaded the ground with a team of horses and a wooden plow. The current owner was a man named Raymond Hargrove. He was 64 years old, had farmed those 240 acres his entire life and had no irrigation system. No pump, no well for field irrigation, no automated controls, no pressure sensors. What he had was a ditch. Bill Kruger pulled his truck over and looked at the field. The corn was shorter than it should have been, the drought had cost it some height, but the leaves were flat and green and the plants were clearly not in water stress. Whatever Raymond Hargrove was doing with that ditch, it was working. Bill had driven past this farm 100 times. He had stopped twice in the early 1970s to offer Raymond a quote on a modern irrigation system. Raymond had declined politely both times. Bill had assumed, the way successful salesmen assume when they lose a sale, that Raymond simply couldn't afford it or didn't understand what he was missing. Now Bill Kruger sat in his truck in the July heat and looked at the only non-stressed cornfield he had seen in 2 weeks of driving this county, and he reconsidered that assumption. Let me tell you about Raymond Hargrove, because he is the reason this story exists. Raymond was the 4th generation of Hargroves on that ground. His great-grandfather Elias had broken the sod. His grandfather Walter had built the farmhouse and the first barn. His father George Hargrove had farmed through the Depression and the war years and had done something in 1941 that nobody else in Calhoun County had done, had not been done since, and that Raymond had spent his entire farming life maintaining and improving. George Hargrove had built a gravity irrigation system. Not a pump, not a well. A system of carefully graded earthen channels, ditches, in the plain language of farming, that captured surface water from Miller's Fork during high-flow periods and stored it in a series of small retention ponds at the north end of the property. From those ponds, the water moved by gravity alone through a network of channels that George had laid out with a surveyor's level and a profound understanding of the land's topography. The principle was old, older than America, older than Iowa. People had been moving water by gravity through channels since before recorded history. The Romans had done it. The Persians had done it. The indigenous peoples of the American Southwest had built irrigation systems on this principle that had fed communities for centuries. George Hargrove had learned it from a book, a 1920s agricultural extension pamphlet on water conservation that he had found at the county library in 1938, when the Dust Bowl was fresh in everyone's memory and George had decided he was never going to be at the mercy of rainfall alone if he could help it. He had spent the winter of 1940 planning the system and the spring of 1941 building it. 14 months of work with a team of horses, a hand-operated slip scraper, and the kind of patience that comes from understanding that you are building something for your children and your children's children rather than for next season. The channels were shallow, 18 inches deep, 3 feet wide, lined with clay from the creek bottom that George had hauled and tamped himself. The retention ponds were modest. The largest was perhaps an acre in surface area, capable of holding about 15 acre-feet of water when full. The whole system covered the north 60 acres of the farm, the fields closest to Miller's Fork where the topography allowed gravity flow. When George finished in 1941, his neighbors had been politely skeptical. A man named Howard Bates, who farmed the land to the east and would eventually become Raymond's father-in-law, had walked the system with George and said it was impressive but probably only useful in wet years when you didn't need irrigation anyway. George had smiled and said to come back in a dry year. Howard Bates had come back in the dry year of 1956 when Miller's Fork was running low and the county's crops were suffering and George Hargrove's North 60 looked like a different county entirely, green and growing while everything else burned brown. Howard had walked those fields and shaken his head slowly. But he had not built his own system. It was a lot of work. The timing was never quite right. And then the 1970s came with cheap credit and modern pumps and the promise of technology, and Howard's son, Raymond's neighbor and cousin by marriage, had installed a modern electric pump system in 1974 and got excellent results in the normal years that followed. In 1988, that pump system was struggling. Raymond Hargrove's ditches were not. Let me tell you about the system Raymond maintained, because it is important to understand what his father had built and what Raymond had spent his life stewarding. George's original system had served him well, but Raymond had spent 40 years improving it. Not dramatically, no bulldozers, no concrete, no modern engineering. He improved it the way you improve something built by hand, incrementally, carefully, with a deep understanding of what you are working with. He had added 3 more retention ponds in the 1960s, following the same principle George had established, using a laser level he had borrowed from the county surveyor and a small crawler tractor to do the earthwork. He had extended the channel network to cover another 20 acres that George's original design had not reached. He had installed simple wooden control gates at key points in the system, hand-operated, made from treated lumber, that allowed him to direct water to specific fields as needed. Most importantly, he had maintained it. Every spring before planting, Raymond walked every inch of the channel system, clearing silt, repairing any bank erosion from winter freeze-thaw cycles, checking the control gates, testing the flow from pond to pond. It took him 4 days every year. He had not missed a single spring in 40 years. His neighbors thought this was excessive. 4 days every spring walking ditches when you could be doing something productive. Bill Kruger, when Raymond had declined his irrigation quote in 1971, had said something that Raymond still remembered clearly 16 years later. Raymond, I understand the sentimental value of something your father built, but this is 1971, we have electric pumps now, variable pressure, automated controls, your father's system is charming but it belongs to a different era, let me show you what modern irrigation can do. Raymond had thanked him and shown him the gate. Now it was 1988, and Raymond's father's system was doing what it had always done, moving water quietly, without electricity, without pumps, without sensors, without anything that could break down or run dry or shut itself off to protect an investment, through channels that had been carrying water for 47 years. The retention ponds had filled during the wet spring of 1987 and the adequate spring of 1988 before the drought set in. Raymond had been careful during the spring filling, checking the levels, managing the gates, allowing some water to flow through the system to the fields while retaining the bulk in the ponds for the dry months he was confident would come. He was not a pessimist, he was a man who had grown up on that ground and understood its patterns. He had seen dry summers before, he had never assumed the wet ones would last. By July, his retention ponds still held enough water to carry him through the season, managed carefully. He irrigated at night when evaporation was lowest, using gravity flow rates that delivered water slowly and deeply rather than fast and shallow. His corn was not as tall as it would have been in a normal year, but it was alive and productive and pulling water through roots that reached deep into soil that had not been baked dry. Bill Kruger pulled into Raymond's driveway on that Tuesday afternoon. Raymond was in the north field checking a control gate. He saw Bill's truck and walked over, taking his time. Bill was leaning against the hood looking at the field. "Morning, Bill," Raymond said. "Afternoon, Raymond." Bill looked at the corn. "Your crop looks different from everything else I've seen this week." "Gravity irrigation," Raymond said, "same as always. Your ponds have water. Filled last spring, managed carefully since May." Bill was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had spent 15 years selling technology, and he was standing in a field that was making him reconsider some assumptions. "How many acres are you irrigating off the gravity system?" 80 acres off the main ponds, 20 more off the secondary system. The south field is dry land. I don't have the topography to reach it with gravity flow. "And the south field?" "Same as everyone else," Raymond said, stressed. "I'll make something on it, but not much." Bill nodded slowly. "My customers are running their pumps 20 hours a day and their wells are dropping. 3 of them had pump shutdowns this week when the water table got too low for sustained suction." He paused. "I sold 17 pump irrigation systems in this county between 1970 and 1980. 17. And right now, looking at your corn, I'm thinking about your father's ditches." Raymond looked at his field, then at Bill. "My father built this system in 1941. He said someday there would be a year when it mattered more than anything else on the farm. He was right about that in 1956. He's right about it again now." "How much did it cost him to build?" "About $400 in materials. Most of the labor was his own and his neighbors." Raymond paused. "How much did your pump systems cost?" Bill was quiet. The average system he had sold in the 1970s had run between $15,000 and $25,000, not counting installation and the well drilling. "More than $400, he said finally. "Yes," Raymond said, "quite a bit more." Bill Kruger drove away that afternoon and made 2 more farm visits before going home. Both farms had struggling pump systems. Both crops were stressed. Both farmers were watching their wells with the particular anxiety of people who have built their operations around something that is now failing them. He thought about Raymond Hargrove's father and his horses and his slip scraper and his 1920s agricultural extension pamphlet, and his $400 and his 47 years of water flowing through clay-lined channels without a single electrical component. He thought about the word charming. "Let me tell you about what happened in August, because that is when the story reached the rest of the county." The drought intensified in August. The National Weather Service issued its first official drought emergency designation for central Iowa. The USDA activated emergency loan programs. The county extension office organized a series of meetings to help farmers assess their options. At the first meeting, held at the Calhoun County Fairgrounds on a Thursday evening with nearly 200 farmers in attendance, the extension agent ran through the standard recommendations. Reduce application rates, check for pump efficiency losses, consider soil moisture sensors to optimize timing, apply for emergency assistance if losses exceeded threshold levels. Then a farmer in the back row raised his hand. "I'd like to ask Raymond Hargrove something," the man said. Raymond, who was sitting near the front and had not intended to speak, turned around. "How are your gravity feed fields doing?" Raymond gave an honest answer. His ponds were at 60% capacity. His 80 gravity-irrigated acres were producing at about 75% of a normal year's yield, far better than the dryland average of 40% countywide. He had enough stored water to see the season through if the drought ended by September, which was the current forecast. The room was quiet for a moment. "Your father built that system," an older farmer said. It was not quite a question. 1941, Raymond said. "He dug the first channels with a team of horses." Another silence. "My father looked at your father's system in the 1950s, someone said. "He thought about building something similar, then the pump technology got cheap and he went that direction." "Most people did," Raymond said. "The pumps work well in normal years. This isn't a normal year." The extension agent, a thoughtful man named Gary Watts who had been in the position for 8 years, listened to this exchange with the focused attention of someone recognizing that something important is happening in front of him. After the meeting, Gary asked Raymond if he would be willing to walk the gravity system with him the following week. Raymond said yes. Gary brought a surveyor and an agricultural engineer from Iowa State Extension. They spent a full day walking every channel, measuring every grade, examining every control gate, documenting what George Hargrove had built in 1941 and what Raymond had improved over 40 years. The engineer, a woman named Dr. Patricia Holt, who had spent her career studying water management systems, asked Raymond the same question Bill Kruger had asked. "How much did your father spend to build this?" "About $400 in materials," Raymond said. "Most of the work was his own labor and his neighbors." Dr. Holt looked at her documentation. She had just spent a day walking a system that was serving 100 acres of crops in the worst drought in 50 years without a single pump, a single electrical connection, or a single automated component. A system that had been running continuously for 47 years with no major failure. A system that was, in the language of engineering, remarkably elegant, using the natural topography of the land to do work that most farmers were paying electricity and maintenance costs to accomplish with machines. "Mr. Hargrove," Dr. Holt said, "are you aware that there are fewer than a dozen documented gravity irrigation systems of this scale still operating in Iowa?" Raymond had not been aware of that specifically, but it did not surprise him. "People move to pumps," he said. "Cheaper to build in the short term, more convenient, you can put a pump anywhere regardless of topography." "But this," Dr. Holt gestured at the channel network around them, "this doesn't break down, it doesn't need electricity, it doesn't run out of groundwater because it's not using groundwater. In a drought year, those are enormous advantages." "My father understood that," Raymond said. "He built it in 1938. He saw what the Dust Bowl did to farmers who depended entirely on rainfall. He decided he wanted a hedge." "A $400 hedge," Gary Watts said almost to himself. "A $400 hedge," Raymond agreed. "That has worked every dry year since 1941. Let me tell you about Bill Kruger, because what happened with him is the part of the story that completes itself." Bill had been thinking since his Tuesday visit to Raymond's farm. He had sold 17 pump systems. Those systems were failing his customers in the drought. And there was a man 3 miles away with channels dug by horses in 1941 that were quietly doing what 17 modern systems could not reliably do. Bill was not a bad man. He was a good salesman who had sold good products in good years and was now, in a bad year, watching those products struggle with a particular discomfort. He had told Raymond in 1971 that his father's system was charming but belonged to a different era. He had meant it kindly. He had also been wrong. He came back to Raymond's farm in September, after the first significant rain of the season had broken the drought's grip slightly and the worst of the emergency had passed. He came not to sell anything or to defend anything but simply to look. Raymond walked him through the whole system. The retention ponds, the channel network, the control gates, the principles his father had used and that he had extended. Bill asked careful questions. He listened carefully to the answers. At the end of the walk, standing at the main retention pond where a thin skin of new water from the recent rain was settling on top of what remained from the previous spring's filling, Bill said something Raymond had not expected. "I'd like to write about this," Bill said. "For the Dealers Association newsletter, I want to tell people what your father built and what it did this summer." Raymond looked at him. "Why?" "Because I've spent 15 years telling farmers that modern is better, and this summer I've been watching modern fail and this," Bill gestured at the pond, at the channels, at the whole quiet system around them. "This hasn't failed once, I think people should know that." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "My father would have appreciated that," he said finally. Bill wrote the article. It ran in the Iowa Farm Equipment Dealers newsletter in October of 1988. It was straightforward, a description of the Hargrove gravity system, its history, its performance in the drought, and an honest accounting of what the author had learned that summer about the limits of the technology he had spent his career selling. The article was reprinted by the Iowa State Extension Service, then by a national agricultural publication. Then, eventually, by a water management journal that cited it in a paper about low-cost irrigation infrastructure in the context of changing precipitation patterns. Gary Watts used the Hargrove system as a case study in the Extension Service's drought response documentation. Dr. Patricia Holt published a paper on it the following year. Iowa State sent students to document it 3 summers running. Raymond Hargrove found all of this slightly baffling. He had not done anything unusual in his view. He had maintained what his father built. He had done it every spring for 40 years. He had managed the water carefully when it mattered. That was simply what you did with something that worked. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story does not end in 1988. Raymond farmed his 240 acres until 1999 when he was 75, and his knees suggested it was time for a conversation about transition. His son David, who had left the county for college in 1975 and spent 20 years working as a civil engineer in Des Moines, came home. Not reluctantly, David had been thinking about coming home for years, had felt the pull of that ground and that system in a way he hadn't fully understood until he was driving back on the day his father called him. David brought his engineering background to the farm in a way that pleased Raymond enormously. He didn't change the system. He documented it properly thoroughly, with precise measurements and grades and flow calculations that George Hargrove had done by feel and Raymond had maintained by experience. He installed simple water level gauges at each retention pond, so the management decisions that Raymond had made by walking and looking could be made with numbers to support the intuition. He did not add pumps. The drought of 2012 was the worst since 1988. The Hargrove gravity system performed the way it always performed in drought years, not perfectly, because no irrigation system performs perfectly in an extreme drought, but reliably without failure, without the groundwater depletion problems that plagued the county's pump-dependent operations. David's children grew up walking the channels with their grandfather and then their father, learning the system the way every Hargrove had learned it, not from documentation, though the documentation now existed, but from walking the ground and reading the water and understanding that what they were maintaining was a conversation between their family and the land that had been going on since 1941. Bill Kruger retired from the equipment business in 1995. He had spent the years after 1988 somewhat differently than the years before, more cautious in his claims for modern technology, more willing to acknowledge that innovation and improvement were not the same thing, more interested in what old systems could teach rather than why they needed replacing. He came to Raymond's retirement party in 1999, one of about 60 people in the Hargrove farmyard on a warm September evening. He stood beside Raymond for a while, looking at the north fields in the late golden light, the retention ponds visible at the far end. "Your father built something that's going to be here long after both of us," Bill said. "That was the idea," Raymond said. "I called it charming," Bill said, "in 1971. I remember. I was wrong about that word." Raymond looked at him. "You were wrong about the word. You weren't wrong that modern technology works. It does work, just not in every year. And the years it doesn't work are the ones that break people," Bill said. "Yes," Raymond said, "those are exactly the years." The gravity irrigation system on the Hargrove farm is still running. David farms the ground now, with help from his eldest daughter who has studied agricultural engineering and brings both the technical training and the family knowledge to the work. The channels George Hargrove dug with horses in 1941 are still carrying water. They have been repaired, improved, extended, but the original grades George laid out with a surveyor's level and 47 years of soil knowledge are still the foundation of everything. The system has never used electricity. It has never run dry because a pump exceeded the water table. It has never shut itself off to protect an investment. It has never required a service call from Bill Kruger or anyone else. It just moves water downhill. The way water has always moved, the way it will always move, guided by channels built by a man who understood that the most reliable technology is the one that works with what the land already does rather than against it. George Hargrove spent $400 and 14 months building something in 1941. In 1988, that something kept 100 acres of crops alive in the worst drought in 50 years while modern systems failed around it. In 2012, it did the same thing again. It will do it again the next time the sky stays clear and blue and merciless through July and August, and the wells drop, and the pump sensors trigger shutdowns to protect the investment. The system does not protect itself, it just works. Bill Kruger sold 17 pump systems and called the old ditches charming. Raymond Hargrove maintained his father's channels for 40 years without asking anyone's opinion about whether they were charming or outdated or belonged to a different era. In a drought year, the only opinion that matters is the one the crop gives. And the crop on the Hargrove farm has been giving the same answer since 1941. The water is there, the channels are open, the gravity still works. It always worked.